It started with a sound that should have been impossible. The Grand City Library was a cathedral of silence. People whispered. The only sound was the rustle of turning pages. Officer Mark Collins was on a routine, boring patrol with his K-9 partner, Shadow. Shadow was a specialist, a passive alert dog. He was trained, under penalty, to never make a sound. His silence was his greatest weapon. Until today. The dog froze, staring at an elderly professor quietly reading in a corner. Then, in defiance of 4 years of immaculate training, Shadow barked. It was an explosive, terrifying sound that shattered the silence. The crowd panicked. The librarian demanded Mark remove the aggressive animal. "Shadow, no, heel," Mark commanded, his voice cracking with humiliation. But the dog refused. He barked again, frantically, his eyes wide with terror, his body coiled like a spring. He wasn't just barking. He was screaming a warning. What happened next left everyone stunned, because what Shadow uncovered wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a threat. It was a secret, hidden inside the human body itself, a secret that was about to take the professor's life. Before we start, make sure to hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of courage and loyalty. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The Grand City Library was not merely a quiet place. It was a cathedral built in honor of silence itself. Its vaulted ceilings soared 3 stories high, supported by massive marble columns that felt cold to the touch, even in the middle of June. The air itself felt heavy and still, thick with the history of 1,000,000 pages. It smelled of old paper, the faint, sweet decay of binding glue, and the sharp, lemony tang of the wax used to polish the endless acres of oak shelving. The only sounds permitted within its walls were small, reverent, and quickly swallowed. The whisper-soft shush of rubber-soled shoes on the polished terrazzo floor. The distant, mechanical click-clack of a librarian's keyboard. The muffled thud of a heavy book being placed on a desk. The rustle of a turning page. A sound that, in the oppressive quiet, seemed as loud as a crackling fire. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, cutting the dusty air into golden shafts, where motes danced like tiny suspended galaxies. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary. And Officer Mark Collins hated it. He hated the silence. He hated the smell of the floor wax. Most of all, he hated the feeling of his own footsteps, the rhythmic thud-click of his regulation boots, echoing into the vastness. It felt like walking on stage in the middle of a play he hadn't rehearsed for. "This is a joke," he muttered, his voice so low it was barely a vibration in his own chest. Beside him, his partner didn't react. His partner was K-9 Shadow, a solid black German shepherd, whose name was less a description of his color and more a definition of his presence. He moved with a liquid grace, his paws making no sound on the floor, his body a 90-pound void of muscle and potential energy. He walked in a perfect heel, his shoulder brushing Mark's leg, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning, sniffing, cataloging. Mark hated this assignment because it was a waste. Shadow was not a therapy dog. He was not a mascot. He was a high-level explosives detection K-9, trained by the best, at a cost that Mark knew equaled a down payment on a house. Shadow was trained to find C4, to detect the faintest trace of TATP, to locate the chemical signature of a detonator cap hidden inside a steel wall. He was a warrior. And for the past 3 days, thanks to a citywide community outreach initiative dreamed up by politicians, this highly trained warrior was being forced to patrol the fiction section. "Just 2 more hours, Shadow," Mark sighed, his thoughts drifting. 2 more hours of this security theater. The budget for the K-9 unit was being threatened again, and the brass thought that having officers walk dogs in public spaces would improve community relations. Mark thought it just made them look soft. He shifted his shoulders. The heavy Kevlar vest felt hot and constricting under his uniform. His feet already ached. He thought about the mortgage payment that was due Friday. He wondered if his wife, Sarah, had remembered to take the chicken out of the freezer for dinner. Thud-click, thud-click. They passed the main circulation desk. The librarian, a stern-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun, gave him a curt nod. He nodded back. She had already complained twice that morning. Once when Shadow's tags had jingled, he'd since taped them down, and once when the dog had sniffed an abandoned backpack, which turned out to contain nothing but a student's gym clothes. Shadow was a specialist. His entire career had been built on not causing a scene. He was a passive alert dog. Unlike the bark and bite patrol dogs, Shadow's job was to be invisible. If he found a scent he was trained for, he didn't bark, he didn't scratch, he didn't jump. He just sat. Silently. He would sit and stare at the object until Mark gave him the all-clear. His silence was his greatest weapon. In his entire 4-year career, through hundreds of sweeps at airports, stadiums, and political rallies, Shadow had never, not once, barked on the job. Until today. It began not with a sound, but with a stop. They were walking past the humanities section, a long, quiet corridor of shelves bathed in the afternoon light. Mark was lost in a daydream about fishing, his steps automatic. He didn't realize at first that he was walking alone. The leash in his hand went taut, pulling him back. He stumbled, annoyed. "Shadow, come on, heel." Shadow did not move. Mark turned. The dog was frozen, standing in the middle of the aisle. His body was perfectly still, a statue of black fur. "What is it?" Mark whispered, his irritation instantly vanishing, replaced by a cold prickle of adrenaline. "You got something?" He scanned the area. A discarded newspaper, an empty coffee cup on a shelf, a college kid asleep with his face in a textbook. Nothing. Shadow's head lifted. His nostrils flared, testing the air. Wuff, wuff, wuff. It was a quiet, analytical sound. He turned his head slowly, his gaze moving past the sleeping student, past the shelves of philosophy, and locking onto the far corner of the room. There, sitting alone in a comfortable-looking leather armchair, was an elderly man. He was well-dressed in a gray tweed jacket and gold-rimmed glasses. He looked like a professor, perhaps in his late 70s, completely absorbed in a thick hardcover book. Shadow's body tensed. It was a subtle shift, a tightening of the muscles in his shoulders that only Mark could have recognized. He took one step forward, pulling Mark with him. "Shadow, no," Mark commanded in a harsh whisper. He gave the leash a sharp, corrective tug. "Heel!" The dog ignored him. He was locked on. A low growl started deep in Shadow's chest. It was a sound Mark had only heard in training, when the dog was frustrated with a difficult find. It was a sound that did not belong in a library. "Shadow, knock it off!" Mark hissed, his face flushing. He saw the sleeping student stir. The librarian at the main desk looked up, her eyes narrowing in disapproval. Mark's brain scrambled for an explanation. Did the old man have food? Perfume? Was he sick? He pulled the leash again, harder this time. "Heel! Now!" And that's when it happened. In response to the command, in defiance of 4 years of immaculate training, Shadow lifted his head, pointed his muzzle directly at the elderly man, and barked. It was not a hello bark. It was not an I'm frustrated bark. It was an explosive, terrifying, concussive sound. A danger now alert that shattered the cathedral of silence, smashing it into 1,000 pieces. It echoed from the marble columns. It rattled the high windows. It caused the sleeping student to jolt awake with a cry. Every single person in the Grand City Library froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the sound. Shadow, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, primal warning, barked again. The bark was a physical thing. It did not echo. It shattered the silence. It was a concussive, violent explosion of sound in a place that had been consecrated to quiet. For a full second, the entire library was frozen in a collective, breathless gasp. The air crackled. The sleeping student in the humanities aisle launched himself backward with such force that his chair toppled over, scattering a half-dozen heavy textbooks across the floor with a series of deafening thuds. A woman in the periodical section let out a small, sharp scream. An elderly man at a computer terminal slammed his laptop shut. Then came the second bark. Louder. More desperate. "Oh my God," someone whispered, and the whisper was a signal. The spell was broken. Chaos took its place. People scrambled to their feet. Chairs scraped and shrieked against the polished terrazzo. A wave of terrified, murmuring sound rolled through the vast hall. "Is it a gun? What is that? He's attacking!" Mark's blood ran cold, then instantly hot. His face burned with a humiliation so profound, it felt like a physical illness. Not here. Of all the places. Not here. This was the PR nightmare his captain had been so terrified of. His perfect, silent, immaculate K-9 broken. "Shadow, no!" he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of command and panic. He yanked the leash with a sharp, brutal tug. "Heel! Stoy! Stop!" The command was one Shadow had obeyed in the middle of simulated gunfire. He had held a perfect sit while a building collapsed in a training exercise. Now he ignored it completely. He planted his front paws, his powerful shoulders straining against the harness, turning his 90-pound body into an anchor of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes, wide and white-rimmed, were fixed on the elderly professor. His barks weren't just barks. They were frantic, pleading, almost screaming. Mark looked at the target. The professor, Dr. Reed, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His book had fallen to the floor. His hands were raised, palms out, his face pale with a look of utter bewildered terror. He wasn't a threat. He was a victim. I didn't do anything," the professor stammered, his voice thin. "Control your animal, officer!" a man shouted from the stacks. Mark yanked the leash again, his gloves slipping. "Shadow Dunogi! Heel! Quiet!" He was sweating now. His authority, his professionalism, his entire career evaporating in front of 100 staring eyes and a dozen raised cell phones. A sharp, percussive click, click, click cut through the rising murmur. It was the sound of hard-soled shoes marching on the marble floor. Mark didn't have to look. He knew that sound. "Officer Collins!" The voice was as sharp and cold as the sound of her heels. Miss Elmsworth, the library's head director, marched toward him. She was a tall, severe woman in a gray suit, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut. Her pencil-thin glasses were perched on her nose, and her eyes, magnified, looked like 2 chips of ice. She was the guardian of this sanctuary, and Mark had just desecrated it. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice low but carrying absolute authority. "This is not a kennel. This is a sanctuary of study. People are terrified. You have been told he was to remain silent. I must insist you remove that creature. This instant." Mark's mind raced. He had 2 choices. Protocol dictated he should obey. He should tuck his tail, drag his broken dog out of the building, and spend the next month writing incident reports, explaining how his multi-thousand-dollar K-9 had malfunctioned and terrorized a room full of civilians. He should flee. But then he looked at Shadow. He really looked at him. And his handler's eye saw something the panicked crowd didn't. Shadow's hackles weren't fully raised in an aggression display. His tail wasn't a stiff rod of dominance. His lips were pulled back, yes, but his barks were high-pitched. He was drooling from the stress. He was trembling, his entire body vibrating. It wasn't aggression. It was terror. Shadow was not trying to attack the man. He was trying to warn Mark about the man. In that split second, 14 years on the force, 6 years with this specific partner, all the thousands of hours of training, all the trust built in dark warehouses and empty stadiums. It all came down to this one moment. His gut versus his humiliation, his partner versus the rules. Trust won. "Ma'am, stay back," Mark said to Miss Elmsworth, his voice suddenly calm, all the panic gone, replaced by a cold, focused certainty. "I beg your pardon?" the librarian hissed. Mark ignored her. He turned his full attention to the dog, who was still barking, still straining. "All right, Shadow. I hear you." He let the leash go slack just a fraction. "What is it? Pokash. Show me." Instead of retreating in shame, Mark took a single, deliberate step toward the professor, pulling his still barking, still panicked dog with him. "Sir, stay back," he called out to the crowd, his voice now the official boom of a cop in control. "Everyone, clear the area, now!" The crowd, which had been pressing forward, now scrambled back. Miss Elmsworth looked at him, aghast, as he and his dog advanced on the terrified old man. Mark didn't know what Shadow had found. A bomb? A chemical? He didn't know. But he was about to find out. Miss Elmsworth let out a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. "Officer, what are you doing? I gave you a directive. Stand down." Mark had crossed his Rubicon. There was no going back. He turned his head, his eyes flat and cold, locking onto the librarian. He was no longer a community relations officer. He was a K-9 handler on a potential threat. "Ma'am, I have an active K-9 alert. I need you and every other civilian to clear this area. Now." His voice was not loud, but it cut through the library's panicked murmur like a razor. It was not a request. It was a command. The shift in his demeanor was absolute. The librarian, for all her authority, was a civilian. He was the law. She saw the change in his eyes and flinched, taking an involuntary step back. The crowd didn't clear. They did the opposite, surging back like a retreating tide, forming a tight, wide semicircle around the scene. A wall of staring faces and raised cell phones, their lenses all aimed at the developing drama. The whispers had changed. The shock of the bark was fading, replaced by a new, more sinister speculation. "What's going on? Is it a bomb? Look at his bag. The dog's staring at his bag. Oh my God, he's a terrorist. The dog found a terrorist." Mark ignored them. He ignored Miss Elmsworth, who was now fumbling with her phone, no doubt calling his captain to report his insubordination. He had only one focus: the dog, the target. He let the leash unspool slightly, giving Shadow just enough slack to move, but keeping a chokehold grip. "All right, Shadow, you've bet my career on this. Pokash." "Show me." He began the walk. It was 30 feet from the central aisle to the quiet corner where the professor sat. It felt like a mile. Every step was a battle. Shadow was frantic, pulling so hard against his collar that he was making horrible, choking, gagging sounds. He wasn't just barking, he was screaming. His paws scrambled for purchase on the polished floor, his nails scraping with a sound that set Mark's teeth on edge. To the crowd, it looked like a scene of horrifying aggression, an animal dragging its handler toward its prey. But Mark saw something else. He saw the dog's eyes, wide and pleading, darting between the man and back to Mark. "Boss, listen to me. Why aren't you listening to me?" They finally reached the man, Dr. Elias Reed. He was frozen in his chair, a statue of pure academic terror. He looked small, impossibly frail, as if a strong gust of wind would shatter him. He wore a gray tweed jacket with worn leather patches on the elbows, a pale blue button-down shirt, and a slightly rumpled bow tie. His gold-rimmed glasses had slipped down his nose. The book he had been reading, a thick volume titled A History of Byzantium, lay splayed on the floor by his feet, its pages crumpled. He smelled faintly of mint tea and old paper. He was, Mark thought, the single most harmless-looking human being he had ever encountered in his entire career. "Officer, please," the professor stammered, his hands raised, trembling. I don't know what it wants. I have no food. I have nothing." Mark's mind was a whirlwind of conflict. He's not a bomber. Look at him. He's 70, maybe 80 years old. This is insane. I've lost my mind. My dog is broken, and I'm ending my career in a library because of a faulty scent. But then Shadow lunged again, not at the man, but at the worn leather satchel on the floor beside his chair. "The bag!" Mark's focus sharpened. It has to be the bag. Of course. Shadow is trained for explosives. The bag is the target. "Sir," Mark said, his voice tight, trying to project calm over the sound of his still barking dog. "I apologize for this, but my partner is an explosives detection K-9. He has alerted to something in your immediate vicinity. I need to check your bag." Dr. Reed looked baffled, his fear momentarily replaced by confusion. "Alerted? To me? Officer, this is absurd. This is my work. It's just books. A laptop. My lunch?" From 20 feet away, Miss Elmsworth's voice dripped with ice. "This is harassment of a patron, Officer Collins. I am on the phone with your superior right now." "Ma'am, be quiet," Mark snapped, not looking back. He turned his full attention to the professor. He had to follow protocol. "Sir, please, just the bag. I need you to step away from the bag." Of course," Dr. Reed said, scrambling to obey. He pushed himself up from the armchair, his legs looking unsteady. Mark holstered his radio and took a single step forward, his hand reaching for the leather satchel on the floor. And in that precise, fractional second, everything changed. Shadow's behavior pivoted. His barks, which had been frantic and directed at the general area of the man and his bag, suddenly became piercingly sharp, almost painful to the ear. He stopped pulling toward the bag on the floor. He reared up on his hind legs, his front paws churning the air, ignoring the satchel completely. His eyes were now locked, with terrifying, laser-like focus. Not on the bag, but on the professor's face and chest. Mark saw it. His hand froze, hovering over the bag. "What?" He looked up from the bag to the man. Dr. Reed's face, which had been pale with fear, was undergoing a horrifying transformation. A new awful color was rising up his neck, a grayish, waxy, translucent pallor. His eyes, which had been focused on the dog, went wide and unfocused. He seemed to be looking at something just over Mark's shoulder, something no one else could see. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. A small, wet gasp. His hand, which had been raised in surrender, moved in a jerky, uncoordinated motion. It grabbed at his chest, his fingers bunching the tweed of his jacket. "Sir?" Mark asked. All the training, all the protocol, all the suspicion vanished, replaced by a simple, sudden, human concern. "Doctor." Reed made a sound, a short, choked groan. I feel dizzy." He didn't finish. His eyes rolled back into his head. He slumped forward, then sideways, tipping out of the tall armchair. He didn't try to catch himself. He fell like a sack of stones, his head striking the wooden armrest with a dull, heavy thud before his body slid bonelessly onto the carpeted floor. The library erupted. The first and loudest scream was from Miss Elmsworth. And in the exact instant the professor's body hit the floor, Shadow, who had been filling the world with his deafening panic, did the one thing that confirmed all of Mark's new, dawning fears. He stopped barking. Instantly. The world, which had been a storm of noise, was suddenly terribly silent. Shadow just stood, his sides heaving, panting heavily, as he stared at the unmoving man on the floor. And then he let out a single, soft, heartbreaking whine. The silence that followed the professor's collapse was more profound, more terrifying than the silence that had defined the library before. It was a vacuum, heavy and absolute, lasting for a single, agonizing heartbeat. Then, the second wave of chaos hit. It was no longer the murmur of suspicion. It was the sharp, piercing sound of pure, human horror. The woman who had screamed first now screamed again. The student who had fallen from his chair pointed with a trembling hand. He's dead." Miss Elmsworth, the librarian, stood frozen, her hand clamped over her mouth, her 911 call forgotten. But Mark Collins was no longer a K-9 handler. He was no longer embarrassed, and he was no longer confused. In the fraction of a second that Dr. Reed's body hit the floor, 14 years of training took over, his mind wiping clean of all thought save one: action. He was in motion before the echo of the man's fall had faded. "Shadow Syad! Sit! Zostań! Stay!" he roared. The dog, whose frantic energy had filled the room, instantly obeyed. The second Mark took charge of the new situation. Shadow's panic ceased. His purpose was fulfilled. He sat, his sides heaving, his body trembling with the adrenaline dump, but his eyes were fixed on Mark, waiting. Mark skidded to his knees on the polished floor, the impact sharp against his kneecaps. His hands were already on the professor. "Sir, Dr. Reed, can you hear me?" The man's skin was waxy, his lips a pale, terrifying shade of blue. Mark's fingers pressed into the man's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. He felt nothing. A faint, fluttery, thread-like movement. And then, nothing. "He's in arrest," Mark yelled, not to anyone in particular, but to the room, to the world. He looked up at the ring of frozen, horrified faces staring down at him. "Someone call 911. Tell them cardiac arrest. Now." He saw Miss Elmsworth flinch, then nod, her hand shaking as she raised her phone to her ear. Yes, a man is down. Officer Collins says it's cardiac arrest." Mark turned back to the professor. He ripped the man's expensive tweed jacket open, buttons scattering across the floor. He tore the blue button-down shirt and the thin undershirt beneath it, baring the man's frail, pale chest. His mind was a cold, clear space. The training kicked in. "Check the airway. Clear. Look, listen, feel, no breath, no pulse. Starting compressions," he announced, more for himself than anyone else. He placed the heel of one hand on the center of the man's chest, laced his other hand over it, and locked his elbows. He began to count, his voice a harsh, rhythmic bark in the silent room. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was a machine. His shoulders burned, his arms pistoning, his mind focused on the single, desperate task of forcing a heart to do what it had decided to stop doing. The crowd was silent, a ring of ghosts. The only sounds were Mark's grunting count, the sickening thud of his hands against the man's sternum, and the thin, wet sound of the professor's last breath escaping his lungs. 10, 11, 12. He paused, tilting the man's head back, pinching his nose and sealing his mouth over the professor's, forcing 2 full desperate breaths into the unmoving lungs. He saw the chest rise. He pulled back, tasting the stale, minty air of the man's last moments. 13, 14, 15. He was peripherally aware of Shadow. The dog had crept forward from his sit. He hadn't disobeyed. He was simply there. He had moved to the professor's side, away from Mark's frantic work, and was now lying on the floor, his head resting near the man's outstretched, unmoving hand. And he was whining. It was a sound Mark had never heard from him before. Not a sound of panic, not of aggression, not of frustration. It was a low, mournful, keening sound. A sound of pure, unadulterated grief. Mark's mind, even in the fog of CPR, latched onto it. 21, 22. He's quiet. He's not barking. He's sad. The threat is gone. The threat was this. The heart attack. 25, 26. He wasn't trying to attack him. He wasn't trying to warn me about a bomb. He was trying to... A new, impossible, staggering thought hit Mark so hard, he almost missed a count. He was trying to tell me. He was barking at the heart attack. He smelled it coming. 29, 30. He gave 2 more breaths. The professor's face was still a mask of grayish blue. "Come on, damn it. Don't you die on me," Mark yelled, his voice raw. He started compressing again. 1, 2, 3. He saw Shadow nudge the professor's limp fingers with his cold, wet nose. A gentle, inquisitive push. "Get up. Why are you on the floor? Get up." He knew, Mark panted, the sweat dripping from his forehead onto the professor's chest. He knew. He knew. He knew. It became a mantra, a rhythm for his compressions. Suddenly his eyes snagged on something. A small, clear plastic pill bottle had rolled out of the man's torn jacket pocket. It had been joined by a small, amber-colored vial. Mark stopped, his hand still on the man's chest. He knew that amber vial. He'd seen it 100 times in training, seen it in diagrams, smelled its inert, oily scent. It was a training aid, a small bottle of inert, stabilized nitroglycerin. It was one of the core chemical components of dynamite. The pieces slammed together in Mark's head with the force of a physical blow. The dog, he wasn't broken. He wasn't crazy. He smelled the nitro. It's his job to find nitro, but... He looked from the vial to the man's face. The professor was on nitro for his heart. But why would he bark? Mark's mind raced. He's a passive alert dog. He should have just sat. Why the panic? Why the terror? A new, more terrifying thought emerged. What if he smelled both? What if he smelled the nitroglycerin and something else? Something that wasn't in his training library. A chemical change, the smell of death? A combination so alien, so horrifying, it had shattered his perfect, silent training and made him scream. "Oh my God," Mark whispered. "Get out of the way. Let us through." The shout was real. Mark looked up. 2 paramedics in full uniform were rolling a gurney toward him, an EKG and a crash cart rattling behind them. Mark fell back exhausted, his arms feeling like lead, his mind reeling. He had just performed CPR for 6 straight minutes, and his dog had just done the impossible. The arrival of the paramedics was like a controlled explosion. 2 men, their movements sharp and economical, pushed a gurney and a red crash cart, its wheels rattling loudly over the library's terrazzo floor. They didn't seem to notice the stunned crowd. Their focus was a laser beam aimed at the man on the floor. "How long's he been down?" The lead paramedic, a tall man with a shaved head and Sanchez on his name tag, barked as he dropped to his knees. Mark, still breathing heavily, scrambled back to give them space. I don't know. He collapsed maybe 6, 7 minutes ago. I started CPR immediately. No pulse I could find, no breathing. "Good. You just bought him time," Sanchez said, not looking up. He was already attaching defibrillator pads to the professor's pale chest. His partner, a younger man, was establishing an IV line in the man's arm. "He's in V-fib," the younger medic announced, his eyes on the portable EKG monitor, which was spitting out a frantic, jagged line. "This is a bad one." "Okay, I'm charging. 300 joules. Clear." Mark instinctively pulled back, grabbing Shadow's harness. The dog, who had been lying by the professor's hand, retreated with him, his eyes still locked on the unmoving man, his body trembling. Sanchez's voice was a sharp command. "Clear!" He pressed the buttons. The professor's body arched off the floor with a violent, unnatural spasm, his heels drumming once on the carpet. He fell back, lifeless. "No change," the young medic said, his voice tight. "Still in fib, starting compressions." He took over Mark's position, his hands pumping rhythmically on the man's chest, his face a mask of pure, sweat-drenched focus. Sanchez was already preparing an injection. "Pushing 1 of EPI, charge again, 360, clear." Another violent electric jolt. The EKG line wavered, jumped, and then a single, blessed blip. "We got a rhythm," the young medic shouted, a note of triumph in his voice. "Sinus tach. Weak, but it's there. I'm getting a pulse." Mark let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his entire body sagging against a nearby bookshelf. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving his arms feeling like heavy, useless weights. He watched as the paramedics worked with practiced, lightning-fast efficiency. They intubated the professor, forcing a tube down his throat to breathe for him, and began bagging him with an ambu bag. They were strapping him to the gurney, a complex web of wires and tubes now connecting him to the whirring, beeping machines on the cart. The entire library was still watching, a silent, horrified audience to a real-life medical drama. Miss Elmsworth, the librarian, was standing nearby, her face ashen, her hands clasped to her chest. Is he going to—" "He's got a chance, ma'am," Sanchez said grimly, not slowing his work. "He's not out of the woods, but he's got a chance. That officer's compressions are the only reason he's not dead." He glanced at Mark. "Good work, officer. Most people freeze." Mark just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. His eyes, however, were on the floor. In the chaos of the resuscitation, the small, amber-colored vial had been kicked aside. It now lay near the leg of the overturned chair. Mark walked over and picked it up. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, the light from the high windows glinting off the glass. Nitroglycerin. The word echoed in his mind. Nitro. 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 He thought back to his K-9 certification, to the long, grueling weeks at the academy. He remembered the scent training. They used hundreds of compounds, breaking down explosives into their base chemical components. They trained the dogs on nitrates, on peroxides, on chlorates. And yes, they trained them on nitroglycerin. It was a core component. He looked at Shadow, who was now sitting calmly at his side, panting, his head cocked, as he watched the paramedics finish their work. The dog was completely, utterly calm. The threat, whatever it was gone. The frantic, screaming, panicked animal from 10 minutes ago had vanished, replaced by the cool, professional K-9 he knew. "You smelled this, didn't you?" Mark whispered, holding the vial out. Shadow sniffed it once, indifferently. Then he looked away. His interest gone, Mark's blood ran cold. That was it. That was the proof. "Sanchez," Mark said, his voice suddenly sharp. The lead paramedic looked up from the gurney. "This vial, it's his, right? Nitroglycerin." Sanchez glanced at it. "Yeah, probably. Sublingual. For angina. He's a severe cardiac patient. We found a medical alert bracelet, too." "Why?" Mark tried to form the words, but his mind was struggling to catch up with the impossible conclusion. "My dog. He's trained for this. For the scent of this. It's a component in dynamite." The younger paramedic paused his bagging. "What? You think this guy?" "No," Mark said, shaking his head. "No, you don't understand. My dog is a passive alert K-9. If he smells nitro, he's trained to do one thing. One single simple thing. He's supposed to sit." Mark looked at Shadow, his heart pounding with a new, dawning awe. He's not trained to bark. He's not trained to panic. He's not trained to lunge. Sanchez frowned, not getting it. So, his training failed. He freaked out. Good thing for the old guy, I guess. "No," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't get it. His training didn't fail. He smelled the nitro. He knew his job. But he must have smelled something else, too. Something wrong." Mark looked at the gurney as they started to wheel it away. The professor's face was gray, his eyes taped shut. He smelled the nitro, Mark repeated to himself. But he also smelled this, the heart attack, the chemical change, the death. And that combination, that's what broke him. That's what made him scream. He looked at his partner, who just sat there, looking up at him, tail wagging once, as if to say, "Are we done here, boss?" Mark reached down and scrubbed the dog's head, his hand shaking. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered. "We're done." The emergency room of City General Hospital was a different kind of chaos from the library. The library's panic had been a sudden, shattering explosion of fear. This was a controlled, rhythmic, and somehow more terrifying storm. The air was cold, sterile, and smelled sharply of antiseptic, latex, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. The lighting was an unforgiving, relentless, fluorescent white that made everyone look exhausted and pale. The sound was not silence, but a constant low-level hum, the beep, beep, beep of a dozen different monitors, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the hiss of an oxygen tank, and the low, urgent coded conversations of the nurses and doctors. Mark Collins felt utterly out of place. His black uniform, still damp with sweat and flecked with dust from the library floor, seemed too dark, too heavy for this sterile white world. His utility belt, with its cuffs and taser, felt absurd. He had scrubbed his hands raw in the ER sink, but he could still, in his mind, feel the strange, waxy texture of Dr. Reed's skin. He stood against a wall in the corridor just outside the sliding doors of the trauma bay. The adrenaline from the CPR had long since drained away, leaving his arms feeling like heavy, useless stumps. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion was setting in, a full-body crash that left his hands shaking. Shadow, his partner, was a rock of quiet tension beside him. The dog hated the slippery linoleum floors. He hated the chemical smells. His nails clicked nervously with every small shift of his weight. He sat at Mark's side, his body pressed hard against his handler's leg, a silent, physical gesture of support. His ears twitched at every new sound, his dark eyes tracking the nurses who rushed past, his nose constantly working, trying to make sense of this place of sickness and steel. The double doors of the trauma bay hissed open, and paramedic Sanchez emerged, now wearing blue hospital scrubs and a surgical mask dangling from his neck. He looked tired, but the frantic energy was gone, replaced by a doctor's calm, analytical exhaustion. He spotted Mark and walked over, stripping off his gloves. "He's stable," Sanchez said, his voice low. "For now." Mark let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding ever since the first bark. "You mean, he's got a shot," Sanchez said, rubbing his eyes. "A massive infarction. The widowmaker. 99% of people who have that one outside of a hospital, they're just gone. We got his heart back into rhythm, but he's not out of the woods. We're prepping him for emergency surgery." He leaned against the wall next to Mark, looking at him with a new respect. "I just came from talking to the cardiologist. He said whoever did compressions, it was textbook perfect. Kept his brain oxygenated for the entire window. You did that. You saved his life, officer. You should know that." Mark just nodded, unable to form words. He had just been doing his job, following a protocol he'd drilled 100 times. But he hadn't started it. "Doc," Mark said, his voice hoarse. I have to ask you something. It's about my dog." Sanchez raised an eyebrow, looking down at Shadow, who was sniffing the cuff of his scrubs. "The dog? He's the one who started this whole mess, isn't he? I mean, good thing he did, but what the hell set him off?" Mark's hand went into his pocket. He pulled out the small, amber-colored vial of nitroglycerin pills. It felt heavy in his palm. "This," Mark said, holding it up. "This fell out of the professor's pocket. It's nitroglycerin, for his heart." Sanchez nodded. "Standard for severe angina. It's a vasodilator. Opens up the blood vessels, gets more oxygen to the heart. He probably felt the attack coming on and was trying to take one." "Yeah," Mark said, his throat tightening. "I know. But my dog, Shadow, he's an EOD K-9 explosives. His primary training scent, one of the first things he ever learned, is nitroglycerin. It's the core component in dynamite." Sanchez's eyes widened. He stood up straight, all the exhaustion gone from his face, replaced by a sudden, dawning comprehension. "Wait, you're saying you think the professor was—" "No," Mark cut him off, shaking his head. "No, that's the problem. That's what I can't figure out. My partner is a passive alert dog. That means when he finds a scent he's trained for, he's supposed to sit. Quietly. He's never supposed to make a sound. It's so he doesn't tip off a suspect or trigger a device. He's a ghost." Mark knelt, looking his dog in the eyes. Shadow just panted back, his tongue lolling, as if completely unaware of the mystery he had created. "In his entire 4-year career," Mark said, looking back at the doctor, "he has never barked on the job. Not once. But today, he didn't just bark. He screamed. He panicked. He went completely against his training. He was terrified. I thought he was broken." Sanchez was silent for a long moment. He stared at Shadow, then back at the trauma bay doors, his mind clearly working. "Officer, what you're saying? It's incredible," he said softly. "What?" Mark asked. "The human body," Sanchez began, his voice taking on the quality of a lecturer. "Especially a body in catastrophic failure. It's a chemical factory. When a heart muscle begins to die, like in a massive infarction, it's not a quiet event. The muscle cells literally burst. They release specific proteins into the blood, troponins, enzymes, but it's not just that." He leaned in, his voice dropping. "The stress on the other organs, the lack of oxygen, the body goes into full-blown panic mode. The liver, the lungs, the kidneys, they all start changing their function. The body releases a flood of, well, a scent. We call them volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. They're chemicals you exhale, they come out in your sweat." He saw the blank look on Mark's face and simplified. "A person in diabetic shock. Their breath can smell sweet, like acetone. A person in liver failure has a different, musty smell. A person about to have a catastrophic heart attack like Dr. Reed, their body is literally screaming for help on a chemical level. Their breath, their sweat, the signature changes. It's a smell of panic, of decay, of death." Mark stood up, the pieces slamming together in his head with the force of a physical blow. "So, he smelled the nitro," Mark said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "from the man's medicine. And his body was also pumping out this other scent," Sanchez finished, his eyes wide. "A chemical cocktail that no human could ever detect. A scream for help." "A combination," Mark said, his mind reeling. "A scent that's not in his training library. A scent that meant nitro plus wrong, bomb plus death." "Exactly," Sanchez said, nodding. "The dog didn't just smell a component of dynamite he was trained to find. He smelled a component of dynamite inside a person who was actively dying. He smelled the imminent explosion. Not of a bomb, but of a heart. He wasn't alerting to a crime. Mark looked at Dr. Sanchez, his own heart pounding with a new, dawning awe. He was making a diagnosis. He was trying to warn you, Sanchez corrected. His training said, sit, be quiet. But his instincts must have been screaming that the bomb was about to go off. He saw a threat his training couldn't classify. So he broke protocol. He did the only thing he could think of to get your attention. Sanchez's pager went off, a loud, insistent beep. He glanced at it. Dr. Reed is out of the ER and on his way to the OR. He's a very, very lucky man. You both are. He clapped a hand on Mark's shoulder. Your dog, that's one for the medical journals. The doctor hurried off down the corridor, leaving Mark alone in the hallway. The sterile beep, beep, beep of the monitors was the only sound. Mark looked down at his partner, Shadow, having no idea of the miracle he had just performed. Simply sat, his tail thumping once on the linoleum, as if to say, "Are we done here, boss? Can we go home?" Mark knelt, his knees cracking. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in his fur, which smelled of library dust and adrenaline. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice thick. I don't even know what to say. I thought you were broken. You were trying to save him. You knew." He just held him for a long moment. A man and his dog in the bright, cold hallway of a hospital. An island of loyalty in an ocean of chaos. "You're a good boy," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. "That's all. You're a good boy." 3 weeks later, the world was a different place. The oppressive, coffin-like silence of the library and the sterile, chemical chill of the hospital felt like a distant, feverish dream. Today, the world was loud and it was alive. Mark Collins wasn't wearing his heavy Kevlar vest or his utility belt. He was in a faded pair of jeans, a comfortable civilian hoodie, and worn-out sneakers. He felt light. For the first time in what felt like a year, he felt truly light. Beside him, Shadow was also off-duty. His imposing K-9 harness was gone, replaced by a simple, thin leather collar. Without the police K-9 patches and the intimidating gear, he looked less like a weapon and more like just a dog. A very large, very beautiful dog whose tail was wagging with a slow, happy rhythm as he sniffed the base of a great oak tree. The park was flooded with the bright, warm light of a perfect Thursday afternoon. The scent of freshly cut grass was thick in the air, mingling with the distant sweet smell of a hot dog vendor's cart. Here, noise was not a violation. It was the entire point. Children shrieked and laughed on a nearby playground. A group of teenagers had a speaker playing tinny music. A breeze rustled the high green leaves of the canopy above. This was a place of life. Mark saw him from 100 yards away. Dr. Elias Reed was sitting on a park bench, facing the sun, his eyes closed. He looked thinner, and a new, pale scar peeked out from the open collar of his shirt. But he was breathing. He was alive. Mark hesitated. He felt a sudden, awkward pang. What was he even doing here? Checking on a victim was one thing, but this felt different. It felt personal. As if sensing his handler's hesitation, Shadow stopped sniffing the tree and looked up at Mark. He then turned his head, his gaze locking onto the man on the bench. Shadow's tail gave a single, solid thump. He let out a soft, inquisitive whine. "Yeah, I see him too, buddy," Mark murmured. "Come on." They walked across the grass. Shadow moved with a calm, easy gait. No pulling, no tension. When they were 10 feet away, Dr. Reed's eyes opened as if he'd sensed them. He blinked, adjusting to the light. His gaze fell on Mark, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. "Officer Collins," he said, his voice softer than Mark remembered, but steady. "I had a feeling I might see you again." "Doctor," Mark said, stopping a few feet away, feeling suddenly like a shy rookie. "Hi. I was just in the area. Wanted to see how you were, recovering." "I am recovering, thank you," Dr. Reed said. He gestured to the park around them. "The doctors call it cardiac rehabilitation. I call it a miracle. One I owe to you." "I just did my job, sir," Standard training. Ah, yes, the professor said, his eyes twinkling. The standard training, where you break every rule in the library and perform 6 minutes of perfect CPR on a man you were, just moments before, accusing of being a terrorist. Mark flushed. Well, about that. Sir, I'm deeply sorry for the chaos. And the barking. Dr. Reed chuckled, a dry, papery sound. Officer, please, do not apologize. You have no idea what you did. He looked past Mark, his smile softening. And this must be the guest of honor. Shadow, who had been standing patiently, stepped forward. He walked slowly, without a hint of fear or aggression, right up to the bench. He stopped, looking up at the man he had only ever seen in a state of mortal terror. Dr. Reed, his hand trembling just slightly, reached down. Hello, Shadow, he whispered. I don't believe we were properly introduced. Shadow pushed his head forward, his cold, wet nose bumping the professor's knuckles. He sniffed the man's hand, the faint smell of hospital soap and the new, clean scent of healing skin. Then, with a contented sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul, he leaned his entire head onto the professor's knee. Dr. Reed let out a small, shaky breath. His trembling hand came to rest on the dog's broad head, his fingers stroking the soft fur between his ears. He's so calm, the professor murmured, his eyes glistening. He's so gentle. It's hard to believe this is the same creature. He sounded... Officer. He sounded like a demon. He's not a demon, sir, Mark said, his voice thick. He's just honest. The most honest partner I've ever had. And he was terrified. He was screaming for help for you. Dr. Reed looked up at Mark, his gaze sharp and profound. The doctors told me, you know. They told me what he did. Not just that he barked. They explained the chemistry. The scent of death, they called it. A phrase I find a bit dramatic. He smiled faintly. But they said I was, in their words, a chemical time bomb. And he was the only one in the world who could smell the fuse. He stroked Shadow's head, his gaze distant. To think, I was in that library all morning. I felt a little indigestion. That's all. I thought it was the sandwich I had for lunch. I was annoyed. I was going to finish my chapter, and then perhaps take a short nap. I would have just gone to sleep. Right there in that comfortable chair. He looked at Shadow, his eyes full of a gratitude so deep it was painful to watch. He didn't just save my life, officer. He called me back from it. He's the reason I get to see another spring. They sat in silence for a long, comfortable minute. The only sounds were the laughter of the children and the soft thump, thump, thump of Shadow's tail hitting the side of the wooden bench. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. Well, we'll let you get back to your rehabilitation, sir. I'm glad to see you're okay. And I'm glad my partner was, I'm glad he was wrong about the bomb. And right about, well, everything else. Dr. Reed laughed. He wasn't wrong, officer. He did find a bomb. He just found one he wasn't trained for. Mark smiled. Take care of yourself, Doctor. You too, son. And thank you, both of you, for everything. Mark nodded, gave a quiet, come on, buddy. And he and Shadow turned and walked away. As they walked toward the park exit, the sun warm on their backs, Mark looked down at his partner. The dog was trotting happily, his tongue lolling, his earlier display of affection already forgotten, his mind now focused on a squirrel up ahead. Mark's mind, however, was replaying the last 3 weeks. The chaos, the fear, the awe. We spend, he thought, hundreds of thousands of dollars and thousands of hours training them. We teach them to find gunpowder, nitrates, peroxides. We teach them to find evil. We teach them to follow our rules, our commands, to sit, to stay, to be silent. But we never train them for this. We never train them for the scent of a human heart breaking. We never train them for the faint, chemical whisper of a life about to be extinguished. We never trained them to find truth. Shadow didn't break his training that day. He transcended it. He'd been given two conflicting commands. His training, which screamed, "Sit, be silent," and his instinct, the ancient, primal bond between man and dog, which screamed, "Warn him! Save him! The bomb is him!" He had chosen. He had chosen to save a life, even if it meant breaking every rule Mark had ever taught him. Mark stopped at the edge of the park, looking back at the old man on the bench, a small, dark figure in a sea of green, alive and well. "You're a good boy, Shadow," he whispered, scratching the dog's ears. "You're a better cop than I am." Shadow just looked up at him, tail wagging, as if to say, "I know. Now, about that hot dog?" Mark laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and for the first time since that day, the memory of the library's shattering silence didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with pride. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We train our K-9s to find the evil we hide. We teach them to find bombs, drugs, and weapons. But we can never train them to find the dangers hidden within ourselves. Shadow went against 4 years of training, breaking every rule his handler taught him, all to obey a higher, more ancient law, an instinct to protect. He proved that the strongest bond isn't built on commands. It's built on trust, and that sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones who follow orders, but the ones who listen to their hearts. Stay tuned for more stories that prove one thing: loyalty, courage, and love can change the world.